Rain had a way of swallowing sound on the open road, of turning each footstep into a muted thud and each breath into a cloud that vanished before it could warm the air. She walked with her shawl drawn close, its threads heavy with water, the fabric clinging to her shoulders as if reluctant to let go. In one arm she cradled the newborn, its tiny face pressed against her collarbone for shelter, and in the other she held the small hand of her eldest, the 7-year-old whose thin shoes were already soaked through. The road was mud and stone, the sky a curtain of silver sheets that blurred the horizon. It had been raining since dawn, a steady, unyielding downpour that carried the smell of wet earth and old wood. Each step seemed to draw more weight into her bones, yet she pressed on, not because she had strength to spare, but because there was no place behind her worth turning back to. The little girl's voice broke through the hiss of the rain, quiet but certain. "Mama, where will we sleep?" She answered without looking down, telling her they would find a place before dark. The child didn't ask again, though her hand tightened, a small pulse of fear passing between their palms. She had been a wife once, not long ago, though the memories already felt like they belonged to someone else. Her husband had been taken by an accident at the lumber yard in the spring, and by summer his family had made their verdict: there was no room for her and the children in their home. They'd spoken with that kind of cold civility that leaves no bruise to show, yet leaves you just as sore. She had tried to barter her sewing, had sold her wedding ring for food. Now even the coin from that was gone. The town came into view through the rain as a scatter of low buildings crouched against the wind, their windows dim, shutters drawn. She slowed her pace at the outskirts, sensing the weight of eyes that sometimes came with small towns. The wooden awnings dripped in long chains, forming puddles that rippled with each drop. She guided the children toward the edge of a porch where the boards rose above the worst of the mud. It was then she saw him, a tall man in a weathered coat, tightening the leather straps on his horse's saddle. His hat brim was beaded with water, the runoff tracing lines over a face that might have been carved from the same cedar posts holding up the porch. He looked at her the way some men look at a distant storm, measuring its direction, deciding if it will pass or come closer. For a moment neither spoke. The newborn stirred, and she shifted the bundle, feeling the damp in the child's blanket seep through to her skin. Without a word, the man stepped aside, gesturing to the space beneath the overhang where the boards were dry. She murmured her thanks, the words barely carrying in the rain. He didn't ask her name, nor did she ask his. The little girl pressed against her leg, watching him with wide eyes, unsure if he was a friend or simply another figure in a world that had grown unpredictable. The man checked the buckles on his saddlebags, his movements unhurried. When he glanced back, his gaze rested on the children just long enough for her to notice, and then he was moving again, stepping into the rain without ceremony. The sound of his boots in the mud faded quickly, swallowed by the steady hiss of water on earth. She stood under the porch a long time after he'd gone, her shawl dripping onto the boards. Somewhere deeper in town, a bell tolled once, marking the hour. The little girl leaned her head against her mother's side, the weight of her trust as fragile as it was unshakable. There was no shelter promised, no meal waiting, only the knowledge that turning back was not an option. She looked out at the road where his footprints were already softening in the rain, and though she could not yet explain why, she felt she would see him again before long. Morning broke without sunlight, the clouds still swollen with rain. The night had left the air heavy and cold, and the thin boards of the shed she'd been given to sleep in had offered little warmth. The newborn lay curled against her chest, wrapped in the last dry cloth she owned. The older girl sat cross-legged beside them, tracing invisible patterns in the dirt floor, her breath faintly visible. Outside, the steady patter of water on the roof was a reminder that the road had not yet dried, nor had her troubles. She stepped out when the town was stirring. Wagons clattered over wet boards, horses snorted against the chill. The shopkeeper who had offered her the shed tipped his hat in passing, but his eyes slid away quickly, as though pity had already done all it could. She scanned the street, not for kindness, she had learned not to expect that, but for possibility. Near the livery, she saw him again. The tall man from the porch. His coat hung dark with water, his movements steady as he loaded a small wagon with sacks of grain and bundled tools. His hat brim kept the worst of the rain from his face, but his eyes, when he glanced up, were as clear and unreadable as before. She lingered, watching. He spoke briefly to the stable hand, his voice low, deliberate. A man who didn't waste words. A man who, from what she could overhear, lived far outside town, alone. That detail caught in her mind like a seed on the wind. By the time she stepped toward him, her decision had already been made somewhere in the quiet hours before dawn, when the newborn's breath was warm against her neck and the older child's thin arm had wrapped around her in sleep. It was not a choice born of romance or longing. It was survival, shaped into something bold enough to speak aloud. She waited until he had secured the last bundle to the wagon. Rain slicked her shawl and ran down her temples. Her voice came steady, though her heart thudded against her ribs. Your daughter needs a home, my daughter wants a father. He looked at her as though weighing the meaning behind the words. The rain dripped from the brim of his hat in slow, steady drops. She met his gaze, unwilling to let her courage falter now. She told him plainly that she could work, keep a home, raise children. That she asked for no promises beyond shelter, food, and safety. That in return, he would have a household, a woman to tend it, and 2 children who would not lack for care. The newborn stirred in her arms, letting out a soft cry. The older girl, standing just behind her, shifted closer, eyes darting between them. He didn't answer at once. His hands rested on the wagon sideboard, rainwater streaking the leather of his gloves. Silence stretched long enough for her to hear the creak of the stable doors in the distance, the splash of hooves in the street. It isn't a small thing you're asking, he said at last, his voice low, carrying more thought than doubt. She nodded. It isn't a small thing I'm offering, either. For a moment, they stood in that narrow space between refusal and agreement. The rain softened slightly, turning from a steady hiss to a quieter patter. A pair of townsfolk passed by, glancing sidelong with a murmur neither could fully catch, the words carried away by the damp wind. He didn't step back. Instead, he looked at the newborn, then at the girl whose small hand had found the hem of her mother's shawl. Something shifted in his gaze, not pity, but recognition of weight he understood. Come on, he said finally, nodding toward the wagon. She exhaled slowly, the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding spilling into the cool air. He moved to lift her small bundle of belongings into the wagon, no questions about the past, no conditions spoken aloud. The older girl climbed up first, settling on the bench beside him. She followed, the newborn still warm against her chest, her mind already turning toward the road ahead. The wheels rolled forward through the mud, the rain following them out of town. Somewhere beyond the low hills, a cabin waited, though she didn't yet know what it looked like or whether it would ever truly feel like hers. She only knew she had chosen the direction, and for now, that was enough. The road to his land was long and quiet, broken only by the sound of wagon wheels finding their way through mud and shallow pools. The hills rose and fell like the backs of sleeping giants, their slopes dark with wet grass. Mist clung low over the ground, shifting as the horse's breath turned to vapor in the cold. She sat in the back with the newborn, the older girl beside the man on the bench, her small frame upright, as if sitting beside him required a certain kind of posture. He spoke little. Now and then he would point toward a ridge or a stand of pines, naming them in a way that suggested they were old acquaintances. The girl listened without answering, though her eyes followed where he pointed. There was no sense of hurry in him, but no idle wandering either, just the steady, measured pace of a man accustomed to traveling without company. The cabin came into view near dusk, rising from a slope above a creek that ran dark with meltwater. Its roof was patched but solid, its walls built from thick-hewn logs that had weathered many seasons. Smoke drifted from the chimney in a pale ribbon, telling her it had been prepared for their arrival, or at least kept ready for his own return. Inside, the air was warmer, smelling of pine and the faint tang of iron from the stove. He showed her the smaller room off the main space, a bed, a chest, and a small window that looked toward the creek. She laid the newborn in the corner of the bed, wrapped in their best blanket, and listened to the older girl's hesitant steps as she explored. Their days began to find a rhythm. He rose early, tending to the horses before the sky had fully brightened. She would set water to boil, her hands remembering tasks they hadn't forgotten even through months of hardship. Breakfast was plain, cornbread, sometimes beans, but eaten without the restless silence she'd known in other kitchens. It was the small acts that caught her attention first. He brought back a length of cedar one evening, and over the next days shaped it into a cradle. He left it outside her door without a word, the wood sanded smooth, smelling fresh as the forest. Another time, returning from town, he placed a folded piece of soft wool on the table, a shawl for her. He didn't watch her reaction, he only set it down and began tending the fire. She answered in kind. His shirts found their frayed cuffs mended, his boots brushed free of dried mud. When he returned from the fields, he would find the stove hot and the table set. She repaired a broken hinge on the barn door herself, and though he said nothing about it, she caught the brief nod he gave when he saw the work was sound. The older girl began to laugh again, a small sound at first, like something testing its own strength. She followed him into the barn, asking questions about the tools and the horses. He never spoke to her as if she were a child too small to understand. He answered evenly, letting her hold the bridle or pour the grain. As for the newborn, he approached with a kind of careful distance, holding her only when asked, yet never awkwardly. On nights when the wind howled through the trees, he would check the latch on their window before retiring to his own room. There were no grand declarations between them, no sweeping moments to mark a change. But there was the evening she stepped outside to find him splitting wood, the snow beginning to fall in slow, steady flakes. His breath fogged in the air, and his coat was dusted white. She carried a steaming cup of coffee to him, her hand trembling slightly from the cold. He took it, his gloved fingers brushing hers just briefly, and for a moment neither looked away. The days turned sharper with winter's approach, and the land around the cabin grew still under its frost. The arrangement they had made was holding, two lives intersecting not in haste but in the slow layering of trust. Yet there was something in the quiet that felt unfinished, as if the season ahead would test whether this was a shelter of circumstance or the beginning of something far stronger. Snow had been falling since morning, a fine, steady drift that softened the edges of the world. The cabin seemed smaller in the white hush, its windows faintly aglow against the gray sky. She was mending a seam by the fire while the older girl arranged wooden animals in a careful row along the rug. The newborn slept in the cedar cradle, the rhythm of her breathing as light as the flakes outside. It was the sound of hooves that broke the stillness. Slow at first, then clearer, several horses moving together. The man was at the woodpile, and she saw him pause, straightening, his gaze fixed on the path through the pines. He set down the axe and stepped to the porch as three riders emerged from the whitened trail. The men dismounted without greeting. She knew them even before they spoke, her late husband's brothers, faces drawn sharp by wind and habit. Their coats hung heavy with snow, their eyes cold in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. "We've come for her," the tallest said, jerking his chin toward her where she stood in the doorway. "And for the young ones. They've no business here." The older girl moved behind her skirt, small fingers clutching the fabric. The newborn stirred in the cradle's shadow, sensing the shift in the air. The man on the porch did not raise his voice. "You'll turn back." "She belongs with kin," another brother said, stepping forward. "You think taking her in makes her yours? You think you've got claim over blood that isn't your own?" He stepped down from the porch then, boots crunching in the snow. The space between them was small, but the cold made it feel wide. "They're under my roof. They stay here." The eldest brother's mouth twisted. "You can't keep what isn't yours. We'll be back, and when we are, you'll wish you'd sent them along." The man didn't flinch. "Come back if you mean to," he said evenly, "but you'll find nothing here willing to go with you." For a moment no one moved. Snowflakes drifted between them, settling on coat collars, melting against the heat of breath. Then, with a sharp pull on the reins, the brothers mounted again. Hooves churned through the white, carrying them away until the sound was swallowed by the trees. He turned then, meeting her eyes. There was no victory in his face, only the steadiness of a man who had decided where he stood and would not be shifted. Inside, she tried to set the needle back to her mending, but her hands trembled too much. He crossed the room, wordless, and lifted the newborn from the cradle, cradling her against his chest. The small bundle stilled, as if soothed by the slow, even beat of his heart. She felt the tight knot inside her loosen, not entirely, but enough to draw a breath without the taste of fear. That evening, after the older girl had gone to bed and the fire had burned down to a deep glow, he spoke from his chair by the hearth. "Does your offer from the rain still stand?" She met his gaze, and this time there was no transaction in the space between them, no bargain struck under the weight of necessity. "It does," she said softly. The newborn stirred in her arms, the older girl shifted in her sleep, and outside the snow fell steady, sealing the cabin in a quiet the world beyond could not breach. The storm had passed, but something in its wake felt permanent, like the roots of an oak driven deeper by the wind.